Good afternoon. My name is Pradeep Kotamraju. I'm the Deputy Director of the National Research Center for Career and Technical Education. This presentation has been co-authored by my colleague Oscar Aliaga, who's the Program Director, and Emily Dickinson, who's the Graduate Assistant working on this project. The National Research Center for Career and Technical Education is based at the University of Louisville and is a consortium of 11 partners. Some of them are Research One institutions, professional organizations such as ACTE and the State Directors Association, as well as other like organizations like SREB and NCES, and we all focus on three items that are listed there, which is basically disseminate scientifically based research and provide technical assistance around that. Our mission focuses on the three aspects of our research and professional development and technical assistance, which is engagement, achievement, and transition, and I will describe or define that in a moment, as well as refine some of that as CTE has changed over the life of the center. Engagement is simply defined as completing high school and completing post-secondary. As Jim Stone, our director, says, basically, if you do not get students engaged, anything that follows after that becomes a moot point. And so the first thing we have to do is to engage the student in whatever endeavor that they are choosing. Followed by that is achievement, which is the technical and academic acquisition of technical and academic and the acquisition of industry credentials. And finally, this transition to continued formal learning, either in post-secondary institutions or in the workplace. And as we know right now, many students, not only just CTE students, probably transition back and forth from work to education. So how has the CTE student traditionally been defined? Traditionally, the CTE student has been defined, or the high school student, before I define the CTE student, is either they're on the academic track or they're on the CTE track, or vocational. That was the language that was used prior to the name change in the late 1990s to career and technical education. And then we have students that are either neither or they are both. And we'll see a graph in a moment. The National Center for Education Statistics at the U.S. Department of Education defines CTE somewhat narrowly. That is, it's fulfillment of an occupational area if 3 or more credits are taken in that area. It's what we call an occupational concentrator. Those of you who are familiar with the Perkins Law, all of the accountability within the Perkins Law is defined through that concentrator, and using that as a demarcation between CTE and non-CTE a lot of times. What we have here then, when we look at these students have different levels and different goals and different interests as they move forward through their high school curriculum. So this is a graph that shows you how the CTE curriculum matches up with the academic curriculum, and it's those 4 categories. In a moment, I'll talk about where some of this definition comes from, but the idea is that for a long time, research was conducted along these 4 lines, and what we are seeking at the National Research Center is to try and modify some of this to include not only the interests of the students in these areas or these choices, but also looking at their coursework and their transcript to try and define essentially what a CTE student might be. In addition to that, you have these academic course-taking requirements. I won't go through these in any detail, other than the fact that it's standard practice right now is that students take 4 English, 3 math, 3 science, 3 social studies, and depending on the school, you may end up with taking a foreign language as well. So the academic requirements, as you'll see from the next slide, is essentially, when you look at this slide, if you look at that line, the yellow line right in the middle, 33 states define academic credits at least as 12 credits or more. And in a 4-year over the high school curriculum, you then have 16 credits left, in some sense, for everything else to be taken, including CTE. So saying someone is academic or saying someone is CTE or dual or neither needs to be sort of looked into further, and that's what we did at the National Research Center. So the mean is around 12.2 credits. In some places it's as high as 16, and in some it's locally defined. So this is a chart that essentially sort of indicates how the different ways in which states define academic requirements. So what you have, a high school experience may look like this. So basically, may look like this, where you have standard credit requirements, the 4 English, 3 math, 3 science, 3 social studies, and then they take some high-level math. So the basics is right in that top box, and then it's essentially looking at the CTE course taking on the right, on your left, looking at intensity, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Currently, looking at the U.S. education data from the class of 2005, roughly about 92% of high school students have taken at least one CTE course. And this has been fairly consistent since the early 1990s, and it hasn't changed very much. And roughly, the average number of credits, CTE credits taken, is about four credits by these high school graduates. So what we went about is trying to reformulating the CTE course taking. So we started with that 3 credit threshold, and once we looked at that 3 credit threshold, we divide that into participants and concentrator. But then we started looking at occupational areas. Just to clarify, the National Center for Education Statistics defines occupational areas as what are specific labor market preparation areas. So these are specific labor market preparation areas, not the general labor market preparation areas. So a specific labor market preparation area would be manufacturing or construction or business. So that's what they're looking at and they have about 13, and depending on the study, they might end up from anywhere from 11 to 12 to 13. Ideally, what we should be doing is looking at this at the 16 career cluster level and using the 16 career clusters to define this CTE course taking pattern. The data source that we use in our analysis is the two majority samples provided by sample survey data provided by the U.S. Department of Education. One is called the ELS, the Educational Longitudinal Study. It's essentially observing. It takes a 10th grade cohort in the year 2002, and they follow that cohort over time, starting, then they survey them again when they're in the 12th grade in 2004, and they have surveyed them again in 2006 when they're entering post-secondary. In addition to that, there now is a 3rd round coming up, which may be in 2012, where these 10th graders in 2002 are around between 22 and 26 years old, and they are entering the labor market after finishing post-secondary or have entered the labor market basically even if they haven't finished or if they've just finished high school. And we hopefully use that data to say something about the employment pattern. So right now we can say a lot about their educational interests, intents, but we can't say very much about their employment choices as they move forward in their life. The other source of data we've used is called the High School Longitudinal Transcripts Study. That is essentially looking at high school public or high school graduates. We only look at public high school graduates. We've looked at the 2005 data and this study, and now we're working with the 2009 data. So these two data sources is what we use in our study. And keep in mind, just as a final comment, these two data sources are publicly available. Anyone can go to that. What we have is what's called the restricted data sources. The restricted data, the difference is it has transcript data for these students from 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, which you do not have on the public site. That's the major difference, and the analysis that we've done is essentially looking at that transcript data of these students and say something about how they take CTE and how that has evolved over time. So the purpose was to understand the level, the mix, and the intensity of CTE course taking within and across different occupational areas. We expanded that participant-concentrated dichotomy that created, actually the word there, we've started using the word typology rather than taxonomy. And then some of you might know that there is what is called the classification of secondary school courses, the CSCC, which codifies every single course a high school student takes in a certain code. There are about 2,000 codes. And we went in there and we actually coded those courses as CTE. We actually went in there and defined that not only as CTE, but math, science, Phi-Ed, performing arts. We went and did all of that. And so that's essentially what we did in terms of looking at, we identified the CTE and academic courses. We divided into these 13 occupational areas. We looked at the different subject areas of academic, math, and science. We looked at essentially, we also then took the math and science courses, and we've started doing this with English, and particularly with English as well, but in this study we only looked at math and science. And we divided into 3 categories: basic, or less than basic, basic, and advanced, both in math and science. An example of basic would be Algebra 1 or Algebra 2 in math. An example of basic science would be Biology 1 or Chemistry 1 or Physics 1. An example of advanced math would be things like calculus or AP calculus, and in advanced science would be biochemistry, biotechnology, and so on. So we did classify that in terms of the math courses, and we know within this data that we know how students take courses, whether they take them in sequence, whether it's academic or CTE. So we know the sequencing. So we can look at, for example, a student that takes English 1, English 2, English 3, English 4, or welding 1, welding 2, welding 3, welding 4, and we can see that and try to sort of gauge the level of intensity that they take in each of these areas, particularly academic and CTE. We then divided, I'm moving ahead quickly here, we divided in terms of these credits. So what we looked at, we identified how many credits high school graduate takes and completes within each occupational area. We determined the total number of credits enrolled and completed across all. So we looked at within each occupational area, across occupational areas, and the number of occupational areas that they took. So we tried to sort of make it, rather than, keep in mind, the traditional definition of a concentrator is what? Is simply 3 credits in any CTE, in a single occupational area. But we wanted to know a little more about what else. So if they were concentrating, for example, in manufacturing, what other areas of CTE did they combine? Did they concentrate in business, taking more than 3 credits, or did they combine that? And you will see that as we go through. So what we did was we built a crosstab, and the important thing about this chart is looking at those numbers. Is traditionally in the CAR data, for example, that states submit every year to the U.S. Department of Education, they combine 1, 2, and 3, and they'll become clearer on the next slide, and 4 is the concentrator. So, and as we go through, so we played around with different groups, different combinations, different occupational areas. But the interesting piece is when we go and we look at the difference, we have a group that takes somewhere between 0 and 3 credits and do not specialize in some sense. That's about 19%. Who had taken a single area. They're basically taken a single occupation area, which is 19%. Those who take in multiple occupational areas but don't reach the 3 credit threshold are 30%. So around half of them either take a single occupational area or take multiple occupational areas but never reach the 3 credit threshold. And so the question we asked ourselves is, why are they doing that? Particularly those who are combining several occupational areas. And why are they doing that but never quite reach the 3 credit thresholds? And are there differences between the next 2 categories? The interesting categories for us are the latter 2. Particularly the 17%, everyone knows what that is. That is the concentrator who specializes in one area, one or more area, and then essentially sort of is CTE bound in some sense. The more interesting fact is this 27% that takes more than 3 credits but does not specialize in any single occupational area. That for us is a very interesting group, and in my mind, a very understudied group as far as aspirations of moving on within CTE and beyond into the post-secondary or the workplace. So we redefined, or at least when we did the study, redefined engagement, where simply as for us, when we look at engagement, we're looking at being involved in a program of study, which many of us define simply as connecting secondary and post-secondary education. Achievement is defining as before academic performance and completing skill development and completing school and college. And transition is moving to post-secondary or the workplace. So let's look at some of the results for engagement. So this is what you have in terms of engagement, which means graduates from public high schools and fulfillment of occupational area. The highest, not surprisingly, is manufacturing, and there are some in lower in the business finance. But the fact that you have a mix of not only what I will call the old vocational areas, but also the newer vocational areas that they concentrate in. So what we did was the following, and I need to explain this. There's a whole methodology behind this, and I don't want to go into the technical aspects of this. But what we tried to do was to say, okay, high school students take a combination of CTE in high school, take this combination of CTE, this typology that we've developed. Then we have information of what they enrolled in post-secondary. And we wanted to see that as they moved up that typology that is moving to 1 to 4, if you remember that chart, did what they did in high school match with what they did in post-secondary, which is essentially the whole notion of programs of study. We weren't going out and testing programs of study. This is just to test the notion that our high school students really sort of have an idea of what they do when they leave high school in some sense. So you can see the important point to remember about this analysis here is that, you know, many of you have felt that when you go out there and talk about career and technical education, in the back of people's mind is vocational education. And there's a standard, typical view that they have. But if you see from this, many of these students are in the newer CTE areas, health, communication design, business. And so they themselves know quite well that that's where they should be going in high school. Yes, there are a substantial number who are taking the old vocational, but that's not the only choices that they're making in high school. And that's but in this one, they are in the newer courses, and they are making some choices, but the connection to post-secondary is not that clear-cut and probably very loose. Now let's go to the next one. Number 2, this is the one that takes more than one area. In this one, basically what you're noticing that the match between high school and post-secondary seems to be getting a little more aligned. That is, what they're doing in high school seem to be aligning somewhat more with what they end up choosing at the post-secondary level. But the interesting thing is the next two groups that we're looking at is the 3, now you can see a more clearer match that when they take more than 3 credits, regardless of the dispersion in areas, it seems to be matching more closely with what they're taking in post-secondary. And it gave us the idea that maybe students are understanding the concept of programs of study, at least subconsciously, if not consciously, depending on what kind of career guidance they might be getting within the high school. But look at number 4. You can see that it's much more where they are taking one single, they know clearly that that's what they want to go to, even though they may mix and match with other areas as well. And so essentially they know that they're moving and they're matching those two areas. So we find in terms of engagement in programs of study that they're in fact making, quote unquote, a choice that is beneficial to them as they move on to post-secondary. And although we don't have employment data in this, I would sort of infer from this that they would be better suited or better placed when they actually complete their post-secondary, whether it's a certificate or an associate degree, in the marketplace and probably do quite as well. So let's look at achievement. When you look at the achievement data, basically this is essentially the graduation rate. And let me preface this by saying the following. You will see that a lot of these graduation rates are in the 90s. And we're looking at these graduate rates, and we hear in the public, for example, that the national graduation rate is 70. I mean, obviously, this is not the place for us to discuss the efficacy of how the dropout rate or graduation rate is measured. So there is a difference in the way researchers and statisticians go about calculating that rate and what the rate might be coded out there in the public out there. What we then looked at these categories and looking at its relationship to GPA. Many of you may have heard about the new report that has come out called Pathways to Prosperity. And in that report, in the Pathways to Prosperity report, they talk about the middle 60% of students. And that has been a constant focus in the CTE research arena for a long time. Parnell called it the middle 60, and some people call it the lost 60, because many of the federal policies either looked at those that were underachieving completely, or those that were doing extremely well, but there were a lot of people in the middle that needed support, and frankly, the only support out there for many of these students was the Perkins funding, both at the high school and the post-secondary level. But the interesting thing to note is that in all four categories, the GPA rises mostly regardless of how much CTE they take. It tends to drop off around 3 there, but you will see from the next slide in a moment, it's not surprising that they drop off, because many of these students, as you will see from this next slide, notice the bottom beyond Algebra 2 and Biology or higher. Several of them are taking advanced math and science, and those are tough courses. Not all of them are going to get A's and B's, and some do end up getting C's, and that's what brings their GPA down. But it's still fairly high. That GPA is still fairly high, enough of them to do well and move on into post-secondary. So we did a study. Let me just briefly, again, this is a very technical, methodologically oriented study that we did in CTE. And I'll bring the whole thing up here. And without going into the details about this, just 2 things. What this technique is essentially saying, suppose you had a group of CTE students that looked a certain way, and I'm simplifying this a lot. Then we take a non-CTE group of students that looked the same way except for one thing. They didn't take any CTE at all. And we wanted to compare those 2 groups. When we compared those 2 groups, we then saw that essentially those who took 3 or more CTE credits, that number there, that 0.52, indicates there's a 50% less chance of dropping out of high school. And so we're just starting these studies in looking at this data. So there is evidence out there right now that the more CTE a student takes, the less likely it would be that they would drop out. And that's true across other factors like sex and where they live and their GPAs, whether it's in the 9th grade or the last GPA that they may have. So that's one of the results that came out by looking at this typology, by comparing 3 or more credits with all other math students. So I'll just quickly put this in terms of and if you look at this, the 9th grade GPA is a constant predictor. So although remember these were 10th grade students, but we do have information on their 9th grade, and that's the key there. So clearly we should be using the 9th grade GPA for all students, regardless of whether they're CTE. And typically what happens, okay, you have a low GPA, therefore in 9th grade, therefore you will be put into CTE. That's not the logic. The logic is to help them to try and make their choice and choose the appropriate combination of academic and CTE to move them forward. Socioeconomic status is important, and there's an important effect on CTE and engaging, and this is essentially comes out of some of the technical analysis within the study. So let's now move on to, this is our CTE inversely related to dropping out. It's not conclusive, but yet important, and it's a nationally represented sample and looks at the CTE credit taking spectrum. So we are going to look at further results. Now let's look at transitions. If you look at this table, look at to your bottom left, that is right in this area where you have enrolled in 2-year colleges, and enrolled in 4-year, and essentially enrolled in 3 or above. what we found here, that of the 26% or 27% that are enrolled in two-year colleges, more than 2/3 of them are taking more than 3 or more CTE credits. And those that are enrolled in four-year colleges, at least half of them are enrolled in two-year college. If you go down the line, most of them going down the 3 or the 3+ or 3 OAF, you'll notice that a majority of them are enrolled in post-secondary. So the notion that there is some sort of a relationship that those who take CTE don't end up at post-secondary. Remember, and these is a continuous, that is, they leave high school and immediately move into post-secondary. That's something that we should be aware of as we move. So CTE students are going into post-secondary, I would say, at probably the same rate as other students as they move forward. So what we've done with this typology is looking at the whole spectrum of CTE credit taking. And we've not really just concentrated on those 3 or more credits in a single area. We've looked at the whole spectrum in some. Secondly, we've looked at between 0, 1, and 3 categories. We had 8 categories. We are now looking at essentially 0 and basically looking at 3, less than 3, 3 with no concentration, and 3 with at least 1 concentration. The key thing here is they respond to different intents, and they respond to different interests and have different plans as they move forward. So, in conclusion, what I would say is that CTE is not what it used to be. That clearly is something we have to keep in mind. So it is not the old vocational education that everyone talks about. The graduation requirements make it different in some sense. They do combine academic and CTE courses in different ways, shape, or form. The participation patterns are different. A lot of it depends on interests and plans and how they move forward, and family support. Within this data, we have that kind of information on family support, what their family condition, how they operate at home. For example, there's a question in this survey that says, do you have a computer at home? That's a big thing in terms of supporting that. So there are various, and we are going to start working on this. As far as this typology is concerned, it took us a while to sort of get this typology in place, and now that we have it, we can do lots of fun things with it and try and answer some of the questions that maybe that you're observing in your classrooms and in your school districts and in your states. The other thing that is there, as I said before, many of those students are in the newer areas. They are in health, even in manufacturing. They're not in the old manufacturing, they may be in the newer manufacturing. Or they're in construction, but they're looking at more like construction management, for example. And the notion of career pathways and career clusters become much more relevant and important for all of us. So, thank you very much.